So anyway, my name is Robin Philpott. I'm publisher of Baraka Books here in Montreal. And I welcome everybody. Thank you for coming and being numerous. I'm sorry we cannot have this as a public event in Montreal, but I guess we're still waiting to see if the pandemic is going to give us a chance. It's one thing we miss as publishers is spending time with authors and celebrating them and their book when they come out. This book, Maker, is a literary genre, working class literature that has virtually disappeared. A reviewer with the Miramichi Reader noted, and I said that, she said, Maker cannot be shoved into any of the four core topics that she learned when she was studying literature in Canada. And those four topics that she learned were sex, religion, politics, and weather. And one of the reasons that we were so interested in publishing this book was because it went back into this tradition, this wonderful tradition of working class literature. Jim Upton believes that working women and men have great stories to tell. The stories that are they're captivating, exciting, surprising. And that's what, so he decided to tell that story, and he has told it very, very well, I must say, based on his 25 years experience in the aerospace industry. The book, and we'll probably get into discuss it, it would take place in French, but Jim felt better writing it in English because most of the characters are French speaking. So that's one of the reasons we really hope to have a French language edition sometime in the future. And by the way, if anybody wants to speak in French during this this launch, feel free to do so. Just to introduce Jim and Elise, Jim is, first of all, is a perfectionist. He's a perfectionist. Maybe Paul knows that. And I hope that Baraka Books has done justice to his perfectionism. He worked for 25 years in unionized jobs in the aerospace industry in Montreal. During this time, he participated in several sets of contract negotiations as a union activist, including one as a member of the Union Negotiating Committee. He lives in Montreal, and Maker is his first novel. Elise Moser, who's going to ask him the questions and have the interview him, is the author of one novel for adults and one for teens. Her most recent book is What Millie Did, a nonfiction book for kids about the woman who invented plastics recycling. She's also a freelance editor and had the pleasure of working with Jim during the development of Maker. She's a coordinator of the Atwater Writers Exhibition, co-organizer of Montreal's annual Holiday Book Fest, and serves on the boards of the Quebec Writers Federation and the English Language Arts Network. She's delighted to have the opportunity to share her enthusiasm for Maker with this crowd. And I would add, as publisher of Baraka Books, she does some wonderful editing work for us. So it's now their turn, Elise and the star of the night, Jim Upton.
Thanks, Robin. Jim, did you want to say a couple of words to the assembled crowd before I start asking you questions?
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone who is involved in organizing the event this evening for making it possible, and also just welcome those who are attending tonight.
Great. As Robin mentioned, I had the opportunity to work with Jim a little bit on this book as it was being developed, and I loved it so much. And one of the things I love about it is that it tells a story that we hardly ever get to read. The inside story of the strike from the workers' point of view, told with not only insider experience and knowledge, but also with tremendous respect for the people involved. Jim, I wanted to start by asking you, Robin mentioned that this is your first novel. Is this your first book?
Yes, it is my first book, and I feel fortunate to have come across a publisher whose vision of the kind of books he wanted to release aligned with the kind of story I had written. And so a big thank you to Robin Philpott and to Baraka Books for publishing Maker. I also really need to thank the Quebec Writers Federation, because a number of years ago, I came across the existence of the QWF. I found out that you could join it for a nominal fee. You didn't have to be a writer. And then you could participate in its twice yearly 8-week writing workshops. And so over the years, I took full advantage of those QWF workshops. I participated in a number of them, and I often submitted chapters or sections of this book as I was working on it. And I was able to get really helpful feedback from the workshop leader, who was either a published writer or an experienced editor, as well as the other workshop participants. And the other activity that the QWF organizes, which I took full advantage of, is a site called Hire a Writer, where someone who has a writing project can hook up with an experienced editor and basically work on a one-to-one basis, including submitting a whole manuscript to the editor and then getting very, very extensive, detailed feedback. And I took full advantage of that as well. So, a thank you to Baraka and also to the QWF, because without the QWF workshops and Hire a Writer site, I don't think I could have gotten a manuscript to the point where it was actually possible to submit it to a publisher.
And what made you want to write a novel?
Actually, I never set out to write a novel. It turned out that way. What happened was, as has been mentioned, I worked for 25 years in an aerospace plant in Montreal. During that time, I went through a number of union negotiations, contract negotiations, as a rank and file member of my union. And these were always the most exciting and interesting times to be in the plant, because this is when you had the most debate, discussion, sometimes action. And I was able to be part of that. And then in 2010, I was part of the union bargaining committee. And so I went through those negotiations from a different vantage point. It was quite an intense experience. It was quite rich. And after it ended, I thought, well, it might be interesting to try and write something about this. Not just that particular negotiation, drawing some lessons of what I had learned from it, but all the negotiations I'd been through. So I started writing a story, what I thought was a story, a short story. And the more I got into it, the more I realized it was something else. And in the end, it took me 3 years to complete a first draft of the story. And it was a pretty rough draft at that point. And then I spent another 7 years revising it with various drafts until I got it to the point where it was possible to submit it to a publisher. So basically, to answer your question, I never intended to write a novel. It just kind of turned out that way.
You had a novel inside you and it had to come out. So one of the things that's interesting about this novel is that your main character, Nicole Fortin, is a woman. And some of the events of her life are unique to women's experience. What made you decide to write a female protagonist?
Well, during the time I was in the plant, one woman was the president of our local for a term. Another woman was the head of the shop committee, the chief shop steward grievance committee, for several terms in a row. Another woman was the health and safety rep. Another woman helped lead the pension committee. Another woman headed up the women's committee in our local. And these were all different women. And Nicole, the central character in the novel, is not based on any of them. But I took note of that fact because it was very striking, because women were only 10% of the workforce, only 10% of our membership. And yet at different points in time, they played a disproportionately large role in the leadership of the union, which was noteworthy. So when I began thinking about writing this story, it seemed to me that it would be much more interesting to have a woman as the protagonist, as a central character, than a man. For one thing, as being part of a small minority of women in a non-traditional work environment, that would raise a whole set of issues in itself. And then I knew that I wanted to write a story about a very challenging labor conflict. And I thought if I threw her into that as well, it could be, a very interesting story, and her journey could be interesting. So from the very beginning, there was never any question. I always knew the central character was going to be a woman. The tricky part was being able to write her character. The first few drafts, I wrote her from a third person point of view. In other words, she said, she walked, she talked. And after a few drafts, I was finding it difficult to get into her head and write the character, knowing how would she react to this? What would she say? What would she think of that? So I decided to switch to a first person point of view. And I found that really helped me get into her character and be able to write her more easily. So I wrote several drafts of her from a first person point of view. I said, I walked, I talked. And I had some people who were helping me along the way at various points in time. And a few of them said, you might want to rethink the point of view from which you're writing your protagonist. And I kind of resisted that because I thought I had gained some real insights into how to write her by using first person point of view. But as the drafts accumulated, I began having doubts of my own. And then at one point I sent off the manuscript to someone to get some feedback. And when this person wrote back to me, they said, look, you have to change the point of view from which you're writing your main character. And this happened to be a man. And that kind of tipped me over the edge. And I agreed, yes, I have to go back to third person point of view. But in doing that, I could keep everything I had gained from writing her from a first person point of view. So that's what I did. I went back to third person point of view, and then everything fell into place. And I thought that worked much better. And that's how it ended up in the novel.
I thought it was really sensitive. There was never a moment when I read it and thought, nah, that's not a woman thinking that or doing that. So one of the other interesting point of view things for me is that there are a number of short sections that are written from the point of view of Martin Goyette, who's the boss, the big boss of the company. And you give us a little bit of insight into how he sees the situation and into what his life is like. You managed to write him without giving away your perspective, the worker side perspective, but also without making him a kind of evil caricature. And I wondered whether that was hard for you, or what was that like for you?
I think it was a bit easier for me to write his character than to write the Nicole character, even though I wouldn't share his point of view. But I think there were a couple of reasons for that. One was during the period I worked in the plant, a number of company presidents or presidents of the plant came through. They did their 3 or 5 year stints and they moved on. Because the plant I worked in is just one plant of many around the world, which are part of a multinational company, which is one of the 3 big players in its field of production with a head office outside of Canada. So, a new president would come through every few years. And each year there would be a meeting of all of the plant employees at some point. where this company president or plant president would give us a report on how the multinational had done the previous year and how the plant we worked in had done. And then he would take questions. And I had a chance to observe how these company presidents conducted themselves, how they performed in these meetings. The other thing is that during the time when I was on the union bargaining committee, we not only met the company bargaining committee, we also met the upper management of the plant from time to time to discuss what they would call issues of mutual interest or concern. And so I got to observe that president on a number of occasions and see how he acted and performed. And the thing that struck me about all of these presidents I saw was that they didn't try and get their way through threats or being ogres or nasty people. Their starting point was always to try and be charming and friendly and convincing and persuasive. That's how they tried to get the workers on side to accept what they wanted done. That doesn't mean they weren't prepared to take off the gloves if necessary. They certainly were. And they were capable of doing that. And I saw that on several occasions. There were a number of negotiations where we rejected 2 offers. And by the time the 3rd offer came down the pipes, a rumor came along with it saying, the head office is pretty ticked off at where this is at. And if this offer is rejected, we're not sure if the plant's going to stay open. And of course, that would just send a chill through the workforce. Right. So when necessary, these people could act that way, but they would never, that wasn't their first option or their preferred option to begin with threats and being nasty. Mm-hmm. It was the opposite, being charming, friendly, persuasive. And so that's how I wrote the Martin Goyette character. Because for me, that's what I saw. That's how these people in a position like his would function. And so that's how he's written.
I want to ask one other question about your choices as you were writing this. It's clear as one reads the book that most of the characters are French-speaking Quebecers, and they are speaking to each other in French. The whole book, most of the book, takes place in French, but you've written it in English. Tell me about that, the thinking process there.
I think one way to read this book is to imagine that it was originally written in French and you're reading an English translation. Because you're right, Elise, almost all of the dialogue in the book is in French. The book's completely in English. There's hardly a word of French in it, but it's made pretty clear when you read the book that everyone is actually speaking in French. And the reason for that is simply that this is a story that is takes place in Montreal, and in Quebec, 80% of the population speak French as their first language. And many people who don't are quite capable of speaking French and often do. So it seemed normal and natural to me that most of the dialogue in a story like this would be going on in French. When I was writing the book, my kind of target audience was it's a book for a Quebec audience, and that's a majority Francophone audience. And even more concretely, when I was writing it, I was really trying to address many times my coworkers, and they're majority Francophone. So I'm glad it's been raised already, but it would be wonderful if we could find a way to get this book translated into French, because it's as much written for a French-speaking audience as an English-speaking audience, even if it happens to be a book in English.
Would you read to us a little bit from the book?
Okay, I'll read 2 brief parts, 2 brief excerpts. I'll just set them up. The first one occurs early on in the book, the union president has just resigned his position to take a management post. And this has happened just before the union's about to go into contract negotiations. And there's a man who is seen as his protege who immediately steps forward and says, well, I'm going to run to replace him. And a woman named Annie, who is a co-worker of Nicole's, central character, and her best friend, says to Nicole, who happens to be a shop steward, look, you've got to run against this guy. I mean, his former mentor is now part of management. If he becomes union president, he's not going to stand up to the company in negotiations. And Nicole says, well, I mean, that's way beyond my capacities. I couldn't possibly be, president of the union. I've never even been on the union executive. So there has to be a union meeting to nominate someone to fill this post. And the meeting occurs and the protege is nominated and no one else steps forward. And at the very last moment, Annie, Nicole's friend, puts up her hand and nominates Nicole. And Nicole is kind of caught on the spot and no one else has stepped forward. She doesn't want to run, but she thinks someone has to stand against this guy. So very reluctantly, she agrees to run and be nominated. So the part I'm going to read is a week later. It's the day of the election for this position. And Annie and Nicole have gone that evening to a bar awaiting the results of the vote. It was just after 8 in the evening when they walked into the bar. Annie went in search of a table while Nicole retreated to the washroom. Despite a considerable effort to appear calm and composed, the last 7 days had been nerve-wracking. It had taken years to get to a place where she felt good about herself again. She knew her limits. Agreeing to run for president went way beyond them. But if she said no, Robert Simard's coronation would be complete, and he'd take that as permission to do as he pleased. She couldn't let that happen. With no expectation of winning, she was hoping for enough support to put him on guard and not embarrass herself. A tall, dark-haired waitress was strolling away by the time Nicole reached their table in the corner. Annie stood up, removed her coat, placed it on the back of her chair. I ordered 2 glasses of red. Is that okay? Nicole nodded and wiped her damp hands on a serviette. My turn for the ladies' room, Annie said. Nicole settled on a chair and glanced out the window. Early December snowflakes swayed across the cone of light from a nearby street lamp and mimicked the motion in her stomach. She hadn't been this wound up for 20 years. She was still fidgeting with the serviette and staring out the window when Annie maneuvered into her chair. How long will it take for the results? Her friend asked. No idea, but the polls closed over an hour ago. The waitress had just delivered their wine when her cell phone jingled. Can I speak with Nicole? A voice said. Yes. Who am I talking to? Annie leaned forward. What happened? Nicole raised her hand with a palm outward. It's Donnie Taylor from the balloting committee. We just finished the count. Congratulations. The pounding in her chest echoed in her ears. What? What did you say? Congratulations, Nicole. You're the new president of Local 1210 of the Amalgamated Metalworkers Union. So that's the first excerpt. I'll just read one other brief excerpt. And this occurs just after a strike has broken out at the plant. It's the first full day of the strike, and we're on the picket line. A line of cops stationed themselves on each side of the entrance to the parking lot as the picketers continued to circle on the sidewalk. Shortly after, a police car slowed down and turned in towards the picket line, followed by several other vehicles. Nicole pushed her way to the front and addressed the nearest officer. What's going on here? Are you escorting these cars across our line? Someone shouted, it's Gilbert LaRose. the machine shop foreman. They're bringing supervisors through. People locked arms and closed ranks. The police officers pulled steel batons from their belts and began shoving people aside. Picketers in the rear pushed the ones in front forward. The first car inched ahead as people shouted and jostled. The line of cops was squeezed up against the lead car. On a signal, they pressed forward and drove people back. The vehicle accelerated into the parking lot, and the others followed. As the cars came to a halt in front of the plant, someone yelled, "We have to block them." A group of strikers ran by the security guards and rushed toward the turnstiles. Nicole said to Richard Beauchamp, a picket captain who was nearby, "Keep people on the sidewalk and maintain the line." She turned to Simon. Simon, I should explain, is another member of the negotiating committee. And I should also mention that a person named Paul Dufour is the ex-president who has taken a management position. He's going to come up here as well. She turned to Simon. "We need to regain control and get everyone back on the line." He took off at a run. By the time they reached the dozen strikers blocking the turnstiles, a few were urging those on the sidewalk to join them. Nicole was trying to convince people to return to the picket line when someone screamed, "Here they come." She glanced over her shoulder and saw a circle of blue-jacketed police moving rapidly from the parking lot in their direction. Inside the cordon of cops, she could make out the parkas and winter coats of those escorted across the line. Suddenly, the automated metal fence beside the turnstiles began to slide right, opening a passageway for the police. Those in front of the turnstiles rushed towards it. Both Simon and Nicole were swept up in the throng. Bodies bounced off the ring of cops, which continued to advance towards the opening. A police baton held by two black gloves smashed into Nicole's chest, grazing her chin. She stumbled backwards, tripped over someone's leg, and tumbled to the ground. An instant later, she was staring up at blue patches of sky, while the shouts of police and picketers moved further away. She raised herself into a sitting position and looked over her shoulder. The cops had succeeded in guiding those who crossed the line through the open gate, which was sliding shut. As she struggled to her feet, Nicole spotted two bodies sprawled nearby. She made her way towards them and recognized Simon's coat. A policeman grabbed him by the collar and rolled him to the side. A second cop bent down over the other body. Paul Dufour was lying on his back, and his eyes were closed. A patch of red was expanding on the snowy pavement beside his head. That's it. I think you're muted, Elise.
Thank you. It wasn't letting me do it myself.
Okay.
So that was quite the cliffhanger. So something else I want to ask you about. One of the things that I really liked about this book is that the events of Nicole's life, the events of this strike, and both levels are connected to a lot of other history, union history, and also other kinds of radical or progressive history. And one of the things that struck me was that Nicole's union ally and friend, Alex McCarthy, talks to her and her daughter about Bobby Sands, the Irish IRA member who was on hunger strike in a British prison in Northern Ireland during the 80s. It seemed to me a very resonant choice on your part And I'd like to know a little bit more about Alex McCarthy, the character, and about your choice to include the story of Bobby Sands in this context.
Well, like you, I remember the hunger strike of Republican prisoners in the north of Ireland, in 6 counties in 1981. In fact, I went there for 2 weeks in the midst of the hunger strike to see things firsthand, and that visit made a lasting impression on me. But when I began writing this book, I had no intention of including Bobby Sands in it in any way. The way this happened is a bit convoluted. I'll try and explain it and keep it brief. There was a very important strike that happened in Quebec in the mid 1970s, in 1974 and 75, at a company called United Aircraft. United Aircraft is now called Pratt and Whitney on the south shore of Montreal. It's an aerospace plant, similar to the plant described in Maker. The strike lasted for 20 months. It was a very bitter strike, a very violent strike, and even though the workers put up tremendous resistance, they were not able to win their demands. But because of the fight they put up, a few years later, there were some very important changes in Quebec labor legislation because of that strike. Just before I went into the negotiations in my plant as a member of the negotiating committee, I read a history of that strike. And I also read a pamphlet put out by the union, the Auto Workers Union, at that plant. What happened was that near the end of that strike, in a bit of a desperate move to try and force the company to settle the strike, a group of strikers occupied one of the plants. And the riot squad was sent in after them. Some of them escaped, but 34 of them were brutally beaten by the riot squad. They were arrested, thrown in jail, and fired from their jobs. And as part of a defense campaign, the union put out a pamphlet. And the pamphlet was a one-page interview with each of these 34 men. And obviously, they were all unique individuals. But the thing that struck me in reading it was how going through such a deep, long, difficult struggle fundamentally transformed how each of these men saw themselves and saw the world. They saw themselves differently after the strike than they had before. They had different priorities in life. They had a different outlook on life. And I wanted to try and find a way to get that kind of transformative experience into the novel. And so I thought, well, one way of doing that would be to create a character who went through that strike and then, worked at another plant, the plant in the book, in fact, Tanner and Ward. And he could transmit that experience that he went through, which profoundly affected him, to someone like Nicole and explain that to her. So I created the Alex McCarthy character as a young man who got hired at United Aircraft, went through all of that, and then got hired at Tanner and Ward and worked with Nicole. There was another element I wanted to include in the story, and that was kind of the Irish-Quebec connection. Because in the 19th century, during the famine in Ireland, I think between 1830 and 1850, 600,000 Irish people came to Canada, landing in Quebec. Many died in the coffin ships on their way. Many died of typhus once they got here. But by 1851, 20% of Montreal's population was Irish, a very high percentage of the population. Obviously, it's much lower today. But even today in Quebec, between 450 and 500,000 people have some kind of Irish connection, some kind of Irish ancestry here. So I wanted to find a way to work that connection into the story. So I thought, well, why wouldn't I make Alex McCarthy, this young man who would go through the strike, why wouldn't I make him Irish, have him be born in Belfast? So I decided to do that. And then I thought, well, why would he come over here to Montreal and then get hired at United Aircraft? And it happened, like I said, in the mid-70s. McCarthy would have come over and, joined the company, see, a couple of years before that in the early 70s. And then I thought, well, the north of Ireland exploded in 1969. And eventually, the British government sent thousands of troops to the north of Ireland. And as the situation intensified, an old traditional way of fighting for Irish reunification reemerged once again. That is a form of armed struggle. And, the IRA emerged once again. And many young people, especially young men began getting drawn into that. And I thought, if Alex McCarthy were 19 or 20 years old, living in Belfast at that time, he might have been someone who would have been drawn into that. His parents might have worried about that happening. They might have thought, well, look, why don't we get him out of here before something like that happens? We'll send him over to Montreal, where he has an aunt living. And so then, of course, he could get hired at United Aircraft. But then I thought, well, if he wanted to get hired at United Aircraft, he'd have to have some kind of technical training, And I had read a biography of Bobby Sands, and I knew that when Bobby Sands was younger, before he got involved in the political struggle in the north of Ireland, he went to a technical school to learn a trade. So I thought, well, Alex McCarthy could go to a technical school and learn a trade. In fact, he could go to the same school as Bobby Sands. They could meet and become friends. So that's how Bobby Sands ended up in Maker.
I want to ask you about Maker, about the title of the book. Tell us how you chose the title.
Maybe the best way for me to answer that is to read a little section of the book. I'll just explain this before I read it. At this point in the story, we're about a week into the strike, and the company is proposing to resolve the strike through binding arbitration. And the union negotiating committee is composed of 5 people, 3 elected members: Nicole Fortin, the president; Alex McCarthy, who we've talked about; and Simon, who I mentioned in one of the earlier readings. He's the 3rd member, elected member of the negotiating committee. But there are 2 union staff members who have also been working with 3 elected members in the course of the negotiations. The 3 elected members do not favor accepting binding arbitration because they're afraid that that will allow the company to impose concessions on the workforce. But the 2 union staff members do favor it because they think the strike is going down to defeat. And they think this, by accepting binding arbitration, they might be able to avoid that. So there's a mass meeting, a membership meeting scheduled, where this proposal is going to be presented and it's going to be discussed and debated. And on the morning of that meeting, Alex McCarthy suggests that the 3 elected members of the negotiating committee meet together at the union office before this mass meeting and just discuss how they're going to make their case against binding arbitration and who's going to carry the ball in that mass meeting. So it's at this point that we enter the story. Alex settled back in his chair. Nicole, do you remember a wee fella who went by the name of Pixie? No. He was an old timer who worked in the machine shop, a real character. I guess he'd retired by the time you arrived. Anyway, the day I started work at Tanner and Ward, he sat down next to me at lunchtime and asked how I'd ended up there. So I told him about the strike at United Aircraft and how some of the lads who led that fight went to jail. They always go after the makers, he said. I asked him what he meant by that. Listen, son, he said to me, I've been here since they opened the doors and seen my share of grabbers who snatch overtime like there's no tomorrow and think that's all that matters in life. Then there's the grumblers who complain about everything and do nothing about anything. And the fakers who talk big but act small. Most of us have behaved this way at one time or another. but we can do better. I know because I've seen it. When this place started up, management ruled like kings. You did what you were told, no questions asked. If you didn't, you weren't around long. This went on for a while. Then some of the lads got together and talked to people after work or went to their homes on weekends. They stuck their necks out, and a few were fired along the way. But because of them, people voted in the union. Those boys were makers, he said. The more we're makers, the less we're grabbers, grumblers, and fakers. Alex paused and leaned forward. You're a maker, Nicole. So that's what Maker's about.
So great. I want to ask you one more quick question, because I know we have other people here who will have questions for you. But I want to hear about this idea of working class literature and other books of working class literature, however you define that, that have influenced you. And then we'll, if we can have a short answer. I know you have a lot to say about this. And then we can bring in some other questions.
Okay. Right, I guess we'd have to define what we consider working class literature or fiction. And I think for me, it's novels, you know, that occur in a working class setting in which principal characters are working class. I'm a late convert to reading fiction. When I was growing up, I read no fiction. I only read nonfiction, mainly books on history and politics. And then about 20 odd years ago, I started reading fiction. And the kind of fiction that attracted me were books like working class fiction. For example, Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, Robert Tretzel's book, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, Emile Zola's novel, Germinal, you know, Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, which for me is kind of the gold standard of these kinds of novels. And when I began reading these books, I realized that most of them were written in the first few decades of the 20th century. And when I began reading fiction, there weren't a lot of books like that being written and published. But I realized, you know, and again, I'm no expert in this field, but I realized the more I read that there were some books like this. In fact, some very widely read and highly respected. I mean, a good example, I think, of working class literature for me is The Tin Flute by Gabriel Roy, which was originally published in French and then translated into English and extremely popular in both languages. I mean, that's a novel about a Quebecois working class family, the Lacasse family, you know, in Montreal, you know, in a period of the late 30s, early 40s. I think the English language equivalent of The Tin Flute would probably be Hugh Garner's novel, Cabbage Town, which is set in the Depression of the 1930s and takes place in a working class part of Toronto. But as I read more, I realized there were a few books like that in there, and I just want to mention a couple of them quickly. There's one by Cecil Roberts, which is about, it's called Slammin' Tar, and it's about migrant workers from Barbados who were brought up to Southern Ontario every year for several months to pick apples and tobacco. And his novel is about their experiences. Another one I came across is by John Bemrose called The Island Walkers, which is about a union organizing drive in a small Southern Ontario town at a textile mill set in the 1960s. And I think actually that book was shortlisted for the Giller Prize in 2003. And of course, Baraka has published the Nickel Range trilogy by Mick Lowe. These are 3 novels about miners and smelter workers in the Sudbury region. And the final novel in that trilogy, Winter Song, is about a strike by the Inco miners in the Steelworkers Union in 1978-79 that lasted for 8 months. I remember that strike. It received a lot of support across the country. And Mick Lowe was not a miner, he wasn't a member of the union, but he lived in Sudbury for a number of years. He knew a lot of the principal players on the union side. And so he wrote an interesting novel about that strike. Just quickly, one thing I've noticed is that some prominent American fiction writers have recently started writing books that I think you could call working class fiction. It tends to be historical fiction, but I'll just give you 3 quick titles. Women of the Copper Country by Mary Doria Russell is based on a strike in Calumet, Michigan in 1913. Jess Walter has written a book called The Cold Millions, which is about a free speech fight in 1909 in Spokane, Washington, organized by the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. And a woman named Kristen Hanna has written a book called The Four Winds, which basically covers the same ground as Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. And just finally, so this might indicate, a bit more interest in this kind of literature, but this is not limited to North America. I came across a woman named Kit DeWall who wrote a novel called My Name is Leon, which is basically a working class novel about a young boy in foster care. It's set in Birmingham in the early 80s. And Kit DeWall's become a champion for working class literature and working class writers in Britain. And she recently edited a compilation of short stories by working class writers called Common People. And spurred on by that, I think Paul McVeigh, a writer from Belfast, who's written, again, a working class novel called The Good Son, he has recently edited an anthology called the 32 County Anthology of Working Class Voices. So it's basically the Irish equivalent of what Kit DeWall did in Britain. So just to wrap up, I think, some of this may indicate a growing interest in this kind of literature, but we'll see.
That is a great list of books. Thank you. I know that Robin Philpott, publisher of Baraka Books, has a question for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Robin, and then we can take questions from anybody else who has one.
There we go. You can hear me? In fact, there were a couple of questions I had which you asked, particularly what kind of books inspired Jim, and also the link with labor history in Quebec. And you answered that. The answers were wonderful, Jim. It was very, very enlightening to hear you describe them. I wanted to use the term working class literature because I don't think people should shy away from it. But do you feel that by talking about it as such, that you're diminishing your work? I don't, but I'm just want to know whether whether you feel that you're being compartmentalized by it. Anyway, maybe you could say something about that.
No, I don't. I don't regret that at all.
Okay.
I think that's an accurate description of the book. And if it shares the same territory as some of the books that I mentioned, I'm not suggesting it's at the same caliber of these books, but if it shares the same territory with these books, then I'm very pleased with that.
You do know that it's an uphill climb to make this kind of book known. There's literature, there's fashions, and this is not fashionable to write working class stories. But that was one of the reasons why I was liked the book so much, was because you went straight at it. So anyway, that was basically the question I had. But maybe there are some other questions. By the way, before we go on, I just want to thank Blossom Tom for organizing this, and Jan Jorgensen, who has graciously shared her Zoom account with us. So thank you. Then we can go on with questions.
So we have a question from Nick.
He's muted.
And Nick, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, am I unmuted now?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Right. Not a question so much, but I just wanted to tell you that, John, that it was a really exceptional book in my mind, as you were able to present us with a very nuanced and, in my opinion, extremely accurate portrait of unions. I was briefly on the executive of my own union way back when I was teaching, and much of what you described is what I saw and experienced. And I thought you did an admirable job, very difficult job in my opinion, and I think you pulled it off tremendously well. Congratulations. That's all I wanted to say.
That's great. Thank you. We have questions from Cora, then Gloria, and then Peter McCambridge. So Cora, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. First of all, I wanted to say congratulations, Jim. This is just such an amazing milestone, and you and I have talked about writing so many times, and we took a workshop a long time ago together. So it's just wonderful to see your work being published. And my question is, are you working on another project these days? I hope so. You got anything in the works?
No, actually, I don't at this point. I'm kind of taking a breather. You know, as I explained, this kind of took 10 years. I was still working when I started it. So when I finished the first draft after 3 years, I was still working, and then, you know, spent another 7 years working on it. So I'm taking a little breather, but who knows, something might, you know, might pop up in the future. We'll see.
Thank you. Gloria?
Yes, well, congratulations. I really want to read your book. I really enjoyed all this empowerment that you gave, or you give, to your main character. And I was wondering if does she come from some place that it's real? Have you met her in your real experience, or is this just your own imagination?
No, she's not based on any particular person I ever met. She is, yeah, I guess she's someone, you know, she's a fictional character. But some of the incidents that occur to her in the course of the story are ones which I either observed or heard about in my workplace. And so I was able to draw on some of those experiences in creating her character. But she's not based on any particular individual that I met or knew.
Okay, thank you.
I think the next question is from Peter. Peter McCambridge. I think you're muted, Peter. So what I'll do is I will just move on to the next questioner and come back to Peter. So Jim Allwell, I think you had a question for Jim.
Yes, I do.
Before you ask it, I'd just like to tell the author that he should take a look at the chat box once this evening is over, because there are so many great comments, and from the audience. So thank you, Jim. I know you were one of those great comments. So we'd love to hear your question now.
Yeah, hi, Jim. Congratulations, great telling of your story and describing your book. And therefore, my question is there a plan? Do you have a plan to try to share this book with some parts of the local union movements, CSN or teachers or whom have you, and do readings? Now, I don't know if they have activities that permit that immediately, but just to try to get the people in the union movement whom should be among the most interested. End of question.
Thanks for your question. It's a good one. It's one I've given a bit of thought to. I don't have any answer or any overall plan. I hope it would be a book of interest to people in the labor movement. As I say, when I was writing it, you know, the people I really was thinking about and trying to speak to and trying to address were my coworkers. And they would be similar to, you know, other unionized workers. So it would be very good if there were a way to have this book more widely distributed in the labor movement, or, you know, have it accessible to people at different events. And if there's any way to do that, I would be certainly interested in participating and making that possible. And one of the key things, as I mentioned, I think, is to get the book translated into French so that it's also available, you know, to working people whose first language is French and who would read a book like this in French. I think that will be an important thing. I guess my my ideal situation would be to have the book available in French and English, and then be able to go to some event with my former coworkers and have the book available in both languages for them. That would be my ideal scenario at some point in the future.
That would be great indeed.
I think Robin had something he'd like to add as well.
Yeah, that is definitely in our plans, but to make it available in French. But one of the things I told Jim is you have to get the book out in English. We got to get some good reviews, good comments, because our colleagues, our French language publisher colleagues, want to know whether the book's going to go, whether it's good, and where they can sell it. I'm pretty sure we'll be able to get one of our French language colleagues to take it on. And Baraka Books has published rarely books in French, because you have to understand the publishing system. You know, it's hard to publish in both languages because it's two worlds. You know, the markets are completely different, and it's very hard to do both. Other publishers have tried and hadn't had much success, but we'll be working on that now that the book is out. We can propose it to a number of publishers who like this kind of book. So and then we can aim at going through the union movement. So anyway, if you have good comments, put them on Amazon, submit them to magazines, reviews, if you read the book, when you read the book, because that'll help make it available to the people who Jim wanted to speak to originally, his co-workers. And by the way, if you'd like to buy the book, and here comes my commercial side, you can click on the image of Maker up above. I think that'll take you to the Baraka Book site, and you can order it. And we have free shipping in North America. So there we go.
I think Tony also wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you. I apparently cannot turn my video back on, but if you could turn it on for me, I'm happy to be seen.
I will try.
in any event, my comment to you, Jim, is I understand your desire to have your fellow workers read the book and benefit from it. It's a tremendous book, and there's great lessons in it and great interest. But I wouldn't at all sell short the importance of a broader audience, particularly for people who are connected to the labor movement, and particularly in English Canada. The story that you told about the United Aircraft strike is such an important landmark battle in Canadian labor history, and not well enough known, particularly not well enough known in English Canada. And people really need to know about that. And they need to understand the ways in which the labor movement in Quebec has led the way and achieved things far beyond what we've achieved in English Canada, particularly anti-scab legislation and some of the other legislation that really came out of the United Aircraft strike. And that was, and even more recently, the Quebec labor movement has won demands on making it illegal to have two-tier contracts for wages and pensions. And, you know, that's hardly, it's not talked about by the labor movement in English Canada, and it really should be, because what an incredible achievement, and it's so critical to the kinds of issues that workers are facing right now. I'm a member of Unifor in my local. I'm the chairperson of the Political Action Committee. I'm certainly going to try to promote this book where I can, but I think it's really important that it gain a broader language, and so I really appreciate that it's published in English. I think that there's great value to be achieved in it. And you mentioned Upton Sinclair. Of course, another book that he wrote, The Flivver King, was published by the UAW when they were first organizing, trying to organize auto workers in the mid 1930s in the United States and in Canada. And that book played a really important role in the organizing effort. So all the revival of working class literature and writing about the conditions of workers, and particularly writing about them in struggle and achieving victories, and being, how they're being involved in a union can be a way for workers to achieve gains, is very, very important and very encouraging to see. So I really congratulate you for this book, and I hope we all can use it to advance the movement.
Thanks for your comments, Tony. And I really agree with the point you made about the fact that the United Aircraft strike was a very important one that is not really widely known enough. I read a book. It's in French. It's called La Grève de la United Aircraft by Michel Pratt, published by Les Presses de l'Université du Québec. I think it was probably a thesis that someone wrote, but they had access to the key leaders of the strike. And so it's a very informative history of the strike. But it's only available in French. And there's also a website available where it's possible to watch interviews with the staff member who was assigned to that local at the time of the strike, who was Robert Dean, and also 2 interviews with Jean-Marie Gontier, who was the secretary treasurer of that local 510 that went through the strike. And those interviews are very interesting. Again, they're in French, but they're very interesting to watch, because that gives you a real flavor for what went on there. And the strike at United Aircraft was in the mid-70s, but through the 60s and 70s, the labor movement in Quebec really was at center stage, in Quebec. Huge fights, huge battles at different work sites, an overlapping of the fight for union rights with the fight for national rights. It was a very, very vibrant period in Quebec history, particularly the 60s, 70s. And this strike was smack dab in the middle of all of that. So, I would, I would encourage people, if they can, to find ways to learn more about that period and about that strike. Unfortunately, there's very little in English about it at the moment.
Okay, and I think our last question for the evening will be from Peter McCambridge.
I think Peter may have had to go because he
Oh,
two little
okay.
kids. But if you like, I'll ask the question he wrote down.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, Peter is my colleague here at Baraka Books, but he said, what is it? Where is it? He said, why do you think there isn't more working class fiction like this? And how come the genre has fallen out of fashion? That was Peter's question.
Well, I can just give you, a thought off the top of my head. I think, what's written, what we see in fiction often reflects what's going on in the broader society. If there are struggles or issues that are very hot, that are very big, you'll sometimes see that reflected in fiction. And if you go through a period where there's a lull in large working class struggles and big union struggles, you probably won't see a lot of books written about that kind of thing. But when you go through big experiences, then that often does get reflected in other forms, artistic forms of one kind or another. Could be cinema, could be art, could be, poetry, novels, short stories. And I think the labor movement has been on the retreat for several decades. I think, the unions are weaker than they've been for some time. Sometimes there's a problem of ossification. Sometimes there's a problem of lack of democracy within the labor movement. And it's really, I think, when the labor movement starts to move forward in a more militant fashion, that we'll see that reflected more in literature. But as I mentioned already, I think there may be some signs that there's a growing interest in this kind of a literature on the horizon. We'll see.
Yep.
Thank you, Jim. I've just shared the link in the chat box if you'd like to purchase a copy, if you haven't already purchased a copy of Jim's book, or if you'd like to purchase another copy of Jim's book. I think Paul has said he would like his inscribed, so I'm sure Jim would be willing to inscribe other copies for others. And I just like to thank you, Jim, for writing such a wonderful book. I really appreciated reading it, and I think you did a great job. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you, Blossom, and thanks for your work, because you helped edit this book. And also thank you for helping to organize the launch tonight.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm going to give the spotlight back to Robin so he can say a few closing things. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Jim, before I do that?
No.
You're good?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much once again.
Normally, at the end of the launch, everybody gives applause to Jim Upton, the author, because it's celebrating a big event he put 10 years into it, and a big event in his life and his contribution to our better understanding the lives of our fellow citizens. So I propose we clap for Jim, even if he can't hear it all. And I'd like to be able to offer you all a glass of wine and a vin d'amitié, but we can't. Maybe it'll happen when we get the French book out. So thank you very much for attending this. We have 5 launches every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. You're very welcome to join in again. You go on, we have Facebook pages for them. Very interesting books. I won't tell you about them all now. But Jim was the first. We decided to do it right after Labor Day to put his book out first. And there'll be one every Wednesday up until the 6th of October. And I'd like to thank Blossom for organizing it. We sort of went into this. We weren't too familiar with how to do it. And Jan for lending us her Zoom system. And so thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for attending, everyone. It's a real pleasure.
So bye, and
Thanks.
thank you, Elise.
Bye.
Thank you, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Elise.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao. Bye.
Ciao, everybody. Ciao.
Bye.